Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this ThinkIn, this business breakfast. We're delighted to be joined by Alison Rose, the Chief Executive of Natwest. Alison, thank you so much for joining us and for making the time. I can imagine that your hours in the office are relatively precious if you're coming in just a couple of days a week, so we really appreciate you making this time available. Just to explain to you, Alison, and to everyone who joins, one of our thoughts at Tortoise was what you don't see these days is a chance to listen to someone who's the chief executive of a large organization that's probably doing a lot, not just to shape their business, but the way in which our economy, our society works. You get those kind of clips on TV shows that may run for 3 or 4 minutes, or you may get an interview in the papers which kind of lands a particular point, but not one of those free-ranging conversations. So we hope that in the course of the hour, we can talk about you, about the bank, about the way in which the UK itself is looking. The nature, though, of a ThinkIn is that it's got its own chaotic logic to it. We want to hear from as many people as possible. So as people have points of view, as they have experiences of Natwest or views about banking and capitalism more generally, I hope they'll weigh in, and as they do, I'll bring them into the conversation. You missed everyone as Alison was joining this rather wonderful scene, because she's in her office in Bishopsgate at NatWest, and the camera started at the end of the boardroom table, this huge long table, and the camera panned in, and we eventually found you there, Alison, at the end of it. But I wanted, if I could, to start with a different end of the lens, at least of your career, because you didn't always sit at the end of the huge boardroom table in the CEO's office. You started, I think, as a graduate. In fact, when we were talking about doing this, one of the things that was most interesting, everyone says you're the first woman to lead one of the big 4 banks in the UK. People know you because of the Rose Review. The thing I didn't know about you was that you'd started as a graduate in the bank, that you were, and so I wondered what the big shiny building looked like, what a bank looked like to a graduate in 1992, what you thought you were stepping into on your first day.
Gosh, yeah, dim, distant past. But I think, like anyone as a graduate starting out, I think the building looked quite intimidating. The banking, really, I had no idea what I was getting into. Banking is, and probably still true today, surrounded by jargon. So it's only really when you get to do the job you understand what it's about. And the great thing about a graduate program is you got to try lots of different things, and then you most importantly, you learn a huge amount about yourself, and then you figure out what you like and what you're good at, and then you evolve. But yeah, probably like most graduates, really excited to start, slightly intimidated, feeling like the first day of school again. So having had that great time at university, then starting a new career and being really excited about it, but somewhat naive about the world of work and having to adjust to it all. But yeah.
Were there things, Alison, that I remember when I started at the FT, I had a really formative experience. I had to write my first 650-word piece on African Airlines, and the editor in charge, the first 5 times I submitted it, just put his hand out with a piece of paper and handed it back. It was so bad. It was kind of beyond commentary from him. He'd just go and have another go. And I remember reading Rob Rubin writing about a mistake that he'd made early in Goldman Sachs, where he'd written this long report, and on sort of page 17 of it said "I," and his boss had just written, "At Goldman Sachs, we say we," right? And I wondered whether you had any formative experiences when you started the bank that sort of said, "Oh, this is the culture of the bank," or "This is the culture of banking that you've taken with you."
Yeah, I mean, lots. And I think the great thing about when you start your career is you learn on the job and you make mistakes as you go. I mean, I think one of the things I found was that I worked with, when you're an analyst associate, you work with, a group of managing directors, and they're all completely different, and they all have completely different ways of doing things. And at the time, on occasion, you would think that would drive you to distraction, because one person would ask you to do something one way and someone another way. But actually, it was a brilliant learning experience, because as you went through, you would I'm a great magpie in that you'd see different ways of people doing different things. You think, oh, that's a really clever way of dealing with that situation or that situation. But yeah, I mean, I had, I remember particularly having reports that I wrote being, staying up, working really hard on them and being given back, and not the right tone, not the right approach. I think the most important thing that I learned and found, which has been a big appeal factor, is banking is very much a team-based sport, and you're working in a team, and it's the culture of the team, not the culture of the individual. Now, absolutely, at that time there was still a bit of the ego of one, but it was very much about teams, and my career gravitated in terms of the areas I went into those areas which were very much about teams working together for an outcome, rather than sort of the very individualistic nature of other areas of the bank.
The reason, I suppose, one of the reasons there was wanted to start with your experience as a graduate, partly because I didn't know any actually other chief executives who'd done what you've done, started as a graduate and ended up CEO, but partly too because I think that everyone is struggling with the question of how to go back to work. And it seems to me that it's probably most difficult if you've just started in a new job, in a new business, and most difficult to pick up the culture. And I was struck, I don't know whether you saw at the beginning of the week, Alison, there was a report in the FT about how US banks, Goldman's, JP Morgan, were, if you like, sort of banging the table and saying, right, everyone back to work. European banks, SocJ and HSBC, being more flexible. And I just wondered how you think about that, how you weigh the benefits of flexibility versus the need of creating a shared culture for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at a hybrid way of working as we come back, and I think the really important thing is, so what I sort of the areas that I'm balancing are, primarily customer service. We have to make sure we're fulfilling that service to customers, that the flexibility that we've got. And I think one thing COVID has done is busted a few myths of, you must do a job in a particular way, in a particular, sitting at a desk. And then also the need to create the culture and collaboration that sort of defines the organization. So, and not every job's the same. So we have some job roles where people are going to need to be back 100% of the time. That is just the nature of the role, whether they're regulatory or just how they work. Others that can be completely remote, and others that can be hybrid. So we're doing a lot of consultation with colleagues at the moment to make sure we can do that. And I'm also really mindful of actually the demographics. So young interns and graduates coming, you learn a lot on the job. And so when you join an organization, you want that being able to turn to someone and say, as I found when I was a graduate, what the hell does that mean? Or how do you do that? Or what would you do? That sort of informal element of learning on a job. So we're evolving all of that, and then creating moments for people to come together for collaboration and culture and connectivity and innovation. But certainly for new joiners, there will be more time in the office to connect and learn with more senior people to make sure you're getting that sort of transfer of culture and skills. So it's not, it's not going to be easy. In fact, all back or all out is probably the easy answer. Actually, the hybrid, so that we can evolve, is what we're looking at doing to make sure we get the benefit of everything.
And Alison, do you think it's transitional? I.e., do you think that come probably summer of 2022, things are much more like they were in the summer of 2019?
No, I mean, I think some of the, a little bit, as once things are out of the box, that we've learned new ways of working. And, nobody would have said, if you'd asked me at the start of the pandemic, could you get 50,000 people working from home in the matter of a week and continue to operate in the same way with the same service? I would have said absolutely not. So I would have been, gosh, that's impossible. But that's what we did. Mm-hmm. And so some of the learnings will carry forward, and it's created a different way of working. And as I said, busted a few myths of how things can be done. So some of those will stick. Some of them, I think, we'll try a few things and they won't work and they'll evolve. So I think creating, keeping an open mind and agility as we roll forward, and having that principle of we've got a job to serve customers, but also create an environment that is positive for our employees. Mm. And I don't think we should underestimate, COVID has been, hugely difficult experience for individuals, but also quite eye-opening. And some people are reevaluating how they want to work and get the benefit right. So I think it will evolve. I don't think it will go back to what it was before. I don't think it will stay like it is. So we'll have something different.
So let's get stuck into it, Alison, because I think the at the heart of the conversation that we really want to have today is around the role of the bank in the way in which we see capitalism and the nature of a market society, and the expectations on a bank and a bank CEO in 2020-21 are totally different to what was expected of a bank in 1992 when you joined. Let's start with, if you like, the sort of the area that you know best. In fact, the area that you've taught most of us most about, female entrepreneurship, because I think the theme that I'd like to explore is the extent to which the deck is stacked in capitalism, and the ability, if you like, for banks to reshuffle that deck to change the way in which we behave. So, you know, the starting point of the Rose Review, and I'm sorry to talk about you in the third person, but the starting point of the Rose Review seemed to be just this very simple fact of a 3-to-1 split in terms of male entrepreneurship to female entrepreneurship, and your point that that's 1.1 million businesses that are just not being created by women. When you look at that, how much of that sits with the banks and the banking industry, with the failure of banks to make capital easily available to women?
I think it's more complex than that. So there is definitely there are definitely barriers that are there, of which banks are one of them. And I think the barriers we found with the Rose Review were lack of access and awareness of capital, of which, particularly for entrepreneurs, it's often not bank financing, it's VC and equity financing. I think putting debt into a business too early is bad, but lack of awareness and access of financing, lack of relatable and local role models, risk awareness, not risk aversion, and a perception of skills and experiences. So what we identified was that there were these barriers, which part of them are endemic in society, in terms of not enough, young girls thinking about entrepreneurship as a career and the barriers that go through. Institutionally, much more male dominated, particularly in VCs and banks. They don't look and reflect what you can get, and then perceptions along the way. So it's a much more complicated thing than just saying it's this problem. So that's the root cause. But then I think there is a role which is my view very strongly, that actually then those organizations like mine, like other banks, like VCs, like the government, have the ability to intervene in order to help practically remove some of those barriers. You can't wave a magic wand. There's no one silver bullet. It's like the whole debate on diversity. There's not one thing, but there are multiple things that you can do to help intervene. And I think particularly for entrepreneurs running a business, the biggest barrier for people starting a business, which is where 5 years ago I said, look, let's lean in and do more to help entrepreneurs, was not knowing where to get help. So big organizations connected into an ecosystem with access to capital can do something about it, but it's not just as simple as saying lend more money. It's much more complex than that, which is why it has to be a multifaceted approach of intervention.
No, and Alison, I suppose that the reason why I was struck by it is that I appreciate the Rose Review had its recommendations and the ones that, if you like, were society-wide. But I was also struck by the fact that one of the things you wrote in it was that within Natwest, putting 500 or so point people who were there expressly to lend, to find female entrepreneurs and make capital available, had a marked difference. I mean, even I think within the course of a year. And so there is much more that's in, not if you like, in the gift of the banks, but at the disposal of the banks if they choose to do it. So the question, I think, is how do we as a society impress upon people like you that this is something we expect of our banks?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it comes, and you're right, targeted intervention makes a real difference. So that sort of awareness and access, and making it simple to get access to finance, that's what we did, and that made a massive difference. And I think it comes back to answer your question, what are we prioritizing? What are the priorities? And when I look at it, it's very simple: supporting entrepreneurs, supporting SMEs, supporting female entrepreneurs where there's massive potential that's not being supported, you can make a difference. And I think it is that conversation. Banks are in service of the economy, in service of customers. That's what we're there to do. We provide liquid capital into the economy. Where do we want the economy to grow? Where are the areas that are underrepresented? Where should we be making the biggest difference? So for me, that really is coming back to the balance between creating a balanced return and support across the economy. So not entirely for shareholders, not entirely for customers, but that balanced need for all stakeholders. And I think it has to be a conversation where we prioritize.
So there are loads of questions on that I'd like to follow up. I want to bring in Flo Cairns though, if I might. I don't know whether Flo Cairns, you've got your camera on, just because you're asking a question about the extent to which a bank CEO should take, if you like, a political, whether it's big P or small p, political stance. Flo, are you there? Can you?
I am, James. I'm only on audio. I don't have bandwidth to do both. So
Fine, okay. I'd certainly know the feeling. Flo, do you want to, Alison, you won't be able to have read possibly as you were talking, but Flo was making a set of points about the sort of the political role, if you like, of the CEO. Flo, do you want to weigh in?
yeah, so full disclosure, I'm here in Edinburgh, so it's a Scottish perspective, and I saw Alison's statement as we ran up to the Scottish elections, and I just wondered, really, given the authority the financial institutions have in our world, in our economy, whether chief executives or leaders of big organizations should make political statements, or perhaps avoid making them during a period of electioneering. It was a question to Alison, really.
Yeah, thanks, Flo. Well, I mean, I think increasingly leaders of an organization should have a point of view on things that are relevant to their organization and the impact they have, but no political intervention. You won't be surprised to know that the first part of my statement was we don't take a political position, and what was reported was a statement that we'd made over 3 years ago, which we'd obviously, when we've been asked previously, from a technical perspective of moving our head office. So I steadfastly avoid making political statements. I don't think we should have a political viewpoint. How it's reported is something different. Oh,
that's interesting. So what happened? There was a patching together, Alison, of we're not making a political statement, and then the head office statement was.
I mean, it was in response to a question which I've been asked before, but was aligned to what we previously said, which was the issue of Scottish independence is for the Scottish people. We have no view. We have a huge amount of people that work in Scotland. It's very important to us. The only difference is that we would move the brass plate of our headquarters from Edinburgh to London because of the size of the economy, which was a position that we've had for the last 3 to 4 years. So no change at all. It was just reported as such. But
oh, interesting. Interesting. Well, can I ask you about something that's an extension of kind of current politics, but also the female entrepreneurship point that we were just discussing earlier too, which is COVID. You know, are you seeing a lot of the worry around COVID is that we're going to see a K-shaped recovery, you know, winners and losers going in different directions? And I wondered, firstly, just in gender terms, whether or not you're seeing female entrepreneurship slow or in fact fall as a result of the impact of the pandemic?
Yeah, we're not seeing any fall. I mean, we've done quite a lot of roundtables and discussions with entrepreneurs, obviously right the way through the pandemic, and we did a piece of research a few months ago. And what we found was that female entrepreneurs were finding it more stressful running their business during the pandemic than male-led entrepreneurs. It was something like 77% versus 56% in terms of the research that we did. And we know, particularly during COVID, when the schools were closed, that was placing a disproportionate burden, not just on female entrepreneurs, but I saw that in my own workplace, with my colleagues as well. However, what we have found is in some ways, the shift of going online, so making all the tools available to entrepreneurs, female-led businesses have benefited from that. Non-traditional routes have been changed. And just to give you a point, we launched £1 billion fund last year for female entrepreneurs. Part of our signposting of money's available, and we'd expected that to be drawn down over 4 years. It was drawn down, it's fully drawn, so I've doubled it to 2 billion. So yes, there has been an impact, and I think that's a broader impact for women across the economy and in different roles. But what we're seeing is the demand coming back from female entrepreneurs as strongly. And I think some of the research actually that the Business Growth Fund came up with said that 63% of women were looking to scale their businesses as they come out of the pandemic. So I think we have to, there's been disproportionate impact, but I think what I've seen is that targeted support is getting there for the female entrepreneurs, which helps. So I think we'll need to track it as we come out of recovery. I think it's super critical that we don't lose sight of the barriers, and I talk quite a lot about the recovery out of the pandemic. We shouldn't lose sight of the challenges that were there before, so that they get lost in the rebuild, which I think is really important.
Can I move from female entrepreneurship to entrepreneurship altogether? You may not have seen, Alison, there's some interesting comments in the chat about the way lending really works. I'm going to come to Gregory Mulligan, who's got a point about lending to big businesses versus small businesses. But I just wondered whether you'd address the fact that I think there's a gap between what people wish their banks were and what banks are, i.e. the relationship bank, the bank that's able to really engage with a small and medium-sized entrepreneur, hear their ideas, make a tailored judgment of what kind of funding they need, and a sense that you're actually waiting on the phone for someone to answer, being ultimately judged by an algorithm or a set of rules, and not really, quote unquote, seen. How much does it bother you that that's the perception of banks?
Yeah, I mean, it does bother me, because I'm a great believer in banking is relationship driven. So what we're trying to do is build a sort of relationship bank backed by really smart digital and tech. I mean, it was one of the reasons I set up the free accelerators that we have up and down the country to create hubs where entrepreneurs could go and get help and support, and then put that support in the hubs with them, including, not just us, but access to the whole ecosystem that provides support. I think there is that practical issue of how do you get support in the right place. We've kept everybody local, but clearly different sized businesses have different levels of intervention. But banking for me ultimately should be about relationship, particularly if you're running a business. You want someone who's going to be there to help you and get the support in the way you want it as well. So I'm a great believer, and that's part of the strategy I'm trying to build, which is a relationship-led bank. But that relationship can be delivered in lots of different ways, and I think we just need to make sure that works.
Let me bring in a few people who've got views or experience of that. I want to come to Gregory Mulligan and Louise Simpson. I'm going to pick up some of the points in the chat too. Gregory Mulligan, do you want to go first? Hello there, morning.
Yeah, good morning. No, the point I was making was, we have this kind of idealized and fictionalized view of what banks are and how they operate. Right now, I think, the reality that I see with banks is if you have a very flat yield curve as you have just now, the banks can't make very much money out of net interest income off the yield curve, which is basically their job, to lend short term, raise funds long term, raise short term. And so banking has become very much about cost cutting. And we see that, quite fiercely at the moment, right across the whole banking system across the world. And, it's interesting to hear, Alison, but I think if you look at the banks just now, the point I was making earlier, the kind of idealized version that the banks lend to small businesses and help them. Most lending goes to the housing market. Vast proportion of capital that's committed in the lending area goes to the commercial banking sector, large companies, and the housing market. Yeah, the other thing I think about banking too that I found very striking through the COVID period is doing a lot of work actually with kind of volunteer organizations and local churches, is that there are a lot of people who don't have access to digital banking. And it's been very striking, you know, being close up with so many people who come to you because you've been a point for people to go to. Their banks are being closed, places are being shut down. Some people don't have mobile phones, don't have the facility to be able to use them. And in that sense, you know, banks as a public utility, which I think in many respects they are. That's why, you know, basically the government has, you know, always has the put option underwritten under the banks. But the banks are failing in that. And you know, Alison didn't say, you know, it's relationship building, but you know, the other comments on the chat have talked to people who found it difficult to actually have a relationship with much other than a bot or somebody on the end of the phone.
Gregory, thank you. Thank you. Alison, I'm going to ask you if you would to answer all of those points. The point about access in the absence of banks and real people, the sort of predominance of housing lending over, you know, small business lending, but also, can you just also help me and possibly a few others out? What is the yield curve and what's the relationship between a flat yield curve and cost cutting?
Sure. So let me try and answer all of those. So with the yield curve, which is basically the interest rates, banks' returns have been diminished very significantly because we make our return as just described there, between what we lend and then the deposits that we raise and the interest rates that we have. So the drop in the interest rates that happened, you know, at the beginning of last year and then through COVID, pretty much knocked around $1 billion of income off the earnings of banks over a 3-year period, because they were making lower returns on the lending that they made, because that was the interest rate, and lower income from the deposits that they were holding. And so the economic model of the bank in terms of profitability is all banks across the global sector reduced very significantly, because that's the predominant return that you make, and then fees on top of that. So that plus regulatory intervention in terms of reducing fees, bearing in mind most banking in the UK, unlike Europe and the US and the rest of the world, we have a free if in credit banking model, whereas other banks globally charge for having a bank account and services. So the way banks make their money is on the yield curve and the money that they lend. So in answer to the
Alison,
question,
just sorry, forgive me for interrupting, but just to understand, does that mean that either a very long low yield curve, a very low interest rate for kind of the foreseeable future, mean either that, as Gregory suggests, you are going to end up with kind of rounds and rounds of cost cutting, or even potentially the introduction of fees for current accounts?
I don't think you'll get fees for current accounts. I mean, there are some fees for current accounts, but it does mean that profitability of the banks drops very significantly, which means that banks have to become more efficient. The cost of running, you know, the banks in terms of the payment systems and you know, the branches and the staff and all the things that we invest in, you know, we make a lower yield, and we are all privately owned and have investors that we have to drive a yield to. So it is a constant balance between providing, you know, and big institutional banks like myself and other large banks support people right the way across from the most vulnerable to the most sophisticated. So we're constantly making sure we can serve
Right.
all, unlike, you know, fintech banks who will just pick a yield. So I think the point around how do you balance that is really important. And what you've seen is a lot of the new fintech and startup banks can start with entirely digital operations, no cash, no branches, no vulnerable requirements. They pick and choose their customers. We support across a broad church. We're constantly trying to find ways to make it more efficient and serve our customers. A lot of the shift to digital has been largely driven by the behavior of customers and the development of tech, but we also continue to support the most vulnerable and the ones who don't have access to cash or technology through different means. So we're making sure we can serve all customers, but it does mean that we have to constantly tune our operating model to make returns, because if we're not profitable, then we can't, you know, we can't build capital, which means we can't lend money, which means we can't support the economy. I think in terms of supporting, businesses, the issue of, where is the capital going? Where are we deploying our lending? I mean, obviously, a big part of banking is lending into the property market, the housing market, and mortgages. But certainly for my bank, 30%. We have 30% share of the business market. We're the largest commercial and SME bank, and so we put a huge amount of lending into different sectors, really focused on relationship managed-led models, as well as, the help for entrepreneurs and right the way through the life cycle. But different models will evolve in different ways. And then for, I think, as you mentioned, elements of society which are excluded, we take that really seriously, and we provide cash, we provide branches, we provide community bankers, we provide mobile vans. We also provide, dedicated teams to help the most vulnerable, and partner with lots of different organisations to support, as well as putting in things like financial capability access and training and development, and big community programmes that we run both in schools and across communities to make sure we provide as much help as we can. So it is a balance between making sure we're financially viable, safe and performing, as well as delivering across the broad church of customers that we support.
Alison, thank you. I just want to bring in Louise Simpson if I can. While you were speaking earlier, Louise posted in the chat, Alison, one of those compliments that you really don't want, which she wrote, "If the bank presented as nicely as you are now, it would be brilliant. This was not the case when I tried to ring earlier this year." So I'm going to ask Louise to make that point. Louise, are you there?
Yes.
Right, far away.
No, well, my experience with NatWest has been painful, because I'm one of your people at the bottom end, really. I'm more of an entrepreneur. I'm not rich. And at any time I've had any difficulty in the bank, it has been a nightmare. And the only feeling I have really had is that it is run by algorithms. I'm delighted. I wish they would clone you, because if I felt I was going to be meeting you in the morning, I would feel positive and, really positive about my future and how you could help me. But I have to say, I've had years of trouble with the bank on many fronts, but I hope they will clone you. I would add that, I tried years ago to get some finance for a sculpture I'd done of Andy Murray when he'd won Wimbledon, and I'd been doing this at Wimbledon for many, many years. And I asked the Royal Bank of Scotland, which I know is you're related, and in the end, it was BNP Paribas who paid for a sculpture of Andy Murray to be cast in bronze. So, I mean, at all levels, I have had difficulty with with the algorithm thing. And if you're at the bottom of the pile, that's what you see. So really, First Direct are amazing with their phone systems. They still work with algorithms, but please, please do what you're saying, because it would be brilliant if you actually did. Alison.
Well, no, look, Louise, do drop me a note and let me know how I can help. We're one of the reasons I set up the Entrepreneur Accelerators was to make sure there was dedicated help for entrepreneurs. And sometimes, putting debt in isn't the answer, but then we can connect to the right partners who can help. But, we're spending a lot of time training and developing our staff, developing our insight and knowledge. I mean, one thing I would say is, our call centers, perhaps for business banking, historically have not been what I would want them to be. And we've been going through a whole program of retraining, redeveloping, using data and insight to help inform people who are taking calls, rather than being the algorithm that says this is what we can do. So there's a huge amount we're doing to get better, and the best way we can learn is getting feedback from you of how we can evolve the model. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to listen to customers and say, how can we change? So please do drop me a line, and if there's anything I can do, I will certainly do everything I can to help. Well, thank you. Just generally, yes, it would be brilliant if it was general help for everyone. Because, yeah, I mean, what you're saying really sounds great, and I'd be very happy to be in touch with you. But I just hope you can create that access to everyone, because it really doesn't feel like that. And the other thing I would say is, please give your lovely bank managers, and there are many in local banks, often say to me, we don't have the power. We can't override the algorithms.
So, you know, if you bring up the personal and the local again, which is kind of going to happen with COVID and everything and everybody having to be more local, you will really create a success for yourselves.
Thank you.
Louise, thank you.
I agree with you, Louise. I think the strength of our relationships is the people on the ground in the local economy, in the local villages, in the local towns, who really understand what's going on. I mean, we increasingly empower people in branches to make decisions. We've made some changes only last year to do that. One of the things we do have is something called a business hub as well, which is where we put, it's basically lots of advice and training and support and sector ideas on the business hub, which is really just there as an advice, support, information that business owners might want or need, or different tips, marketing, how to set up a website, all those good things. So that's something we're increasingly trying to do, and we shape that based on feedback from customers as well. So see if that is of help. But certainly the strength of any bank is its people, and one of the things I'm really proud of is right the way through the pandemic, our branches have stayed open where they can, and the support people have provided, and the call out program that we've been doing to vulnerable customers. We've called over 1 million people just to check in and make sure they're okay, particularly the most vulnerable who have had to isolate the most. So we're trying to be much more connected, and my colleagues are doing that.
Alison, can I ask you, I suppose it picks up on Louise's point, can I ask you about how you make sure that the things that you say are the things that the bank actually does? And I wanted to turn, if you like, to some of the issues about sort of sustainability, but also ethical behavior in the bank, right? So how you make sure that the lending decisions the banks make accord to what the bank's ambitions are in terms of, let's say, Scope 3 emissions, or how you make sure that the bank's customers are behaving ethically, and how that actual process works in the banks. Because I think people have seen and heard from you an ambition around, for example, sustainability, but what we don't know is when you lift up the bonnet, actually how the thing works inside.
Yeah, I mean, it's through lots of different ways. I mean, actually, from a sustainability perspective and climate perspective and emissions perspective, much easier to track, because we have credit policies, appetite policies, guidelines of lending that are very very clear and then reportable. So you can see the data that says we've. So I know, for example, on our balance sheet, only 0.8% of our balance sheet is lent to oil and gas. So I can see that, we can track that, and we monitor that. So there's lots of credit risk policies that we align, and as we change our appetite, we can flex that up and down, and we review that.
And Alison, forgive me, sorry to interrupt, but for example, right, if you've got a big mining company or an oil and gas company, what do you say to them as lenders? What's the leverage that you've got with them to say, we'll give you the money, but only if you make X or Y emissions commitments? Is it as granular as that? How does it work?
Yes. So we've one of the things I did last year was I set a very clear strategy on climate. It was sort of 3 areas. We said, get our own house in order, so our own emissions, so net zero by the end of last year, which we were, and net positive by 2025. Harmful activities, we identified the exposures on our balance sheet to oil and gas and coal. We've said we'll phase out coal by 2030, and then oil and gas, it's a small number, only 0.8% of our balance sheet. With each of those customers, we have said, we will continue to lend to you, but we're focused on transition. So we need to see a credible transition plan by the end of this year, aligned to Paris, for us to continue lending to you. So our relationship managers work with those companies, and then we evaluate the emissions and the plan, and then we track against it. We put incentives into our lending so that as you hit sustainable goals, we reduce the pricing. So we create that dynamic. And then more broadly across our whole balance sheet, and there is a bit of a challenge here, which is a global one, of getting consistent data. we have mapped the emissions of our financing, because I've put a target out to say by 2030, I will halve the emissions from our financing on our balance sheet. So we've already measured 4 of our major sectors for emissions, which is about 46% of our balance sheet. And then we're then going to say, how do we halve those emissions? We're not going to be able to do that ourselves. It will need collaboration across the sector, the public-private sector, global targets, but starting by being very clear about what we're doing, and then most importantly, funding the transition. I think, I think this move to a low carbon economy, it has to be about funding the transition. I put a target out last year to get to 20 billion of renewable financing by next year. We're already at 12 billion. So we expect to beat the 20 billion this year. So funding the transition, measuring, and then ending, making sure our own house is in order. So it's very granular in terms of how we do it. I just want to touch on the other part of your question is, how do I know what's happening everywhere in the organization? Well, there are lots of ways of doing that. There's the technical measures. There is the ethical way of how we treat customers. It's not what's just written on the page, it's how we behave. A good way of doing that is I get home every weekend with a pile of complaint letters, and I read them and I check what's happening. I do round tables with customers and ask them directly what's happening. We look at our complaints data. We also have our own whistleblowing, so that we get colleagues to share, and we do lots of round tables, and we set very high standards of conduct and culture. And with 63,000 people in an organization, not everybody's going to get it right all the time, but we set pretty high standards of behavior, and then we check and we double check, and I try and make sure. I think a really important thing, which I insist all of my executive do and I do, is spend time with customers and talk to them, ask what's really going on, so that you get a feel rather than just looking at the data.
And
so
what
I do it in lots of different ways.
And how do you take that role? Thank you, by the way, for the answer on sustainability. It really makes clear sense that. How do you make a different set of decisions, or use the influence and the power of the bank as regards what I think of as the culture of capitalism? So 2 obvious examples. One recently was Deliveroo, right? That's obviously a business with millions of customers, and it's doing something in the marketplace, but there are arguments about the way in which it operates in a gig economy and treatment of employees. And then secondly, you obviously saw the case in March where the FCA announced that it was going to investigate a money laundering case, a criminal investigation into Natwest. One is clearly a crime where or an investigation into a crime where you have to say, okay, well, how does that happen? But the other one is, how do you make judgments on the ethics of other people's businesses and who you will and won't lend to? So will you talk a little bit about how you see the CEO's role in that context?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, we have to balance between supporting the economy and not being the moral arbiter of the economy, but a clear part of that is what is our ethical policy, what is our culture, what is our sustainability policy, and so there are some there are the hard lines, which are in terms of things like financial crime, where our role is to work really hard to prevent that. So we put a lot of systems and controls in place to do that. I have 4,000 people whose job solely is to prevent financial crime, and we've invested over the last 3 years almost $500 million in terms of systems and controls to do that. So there's those hard lines where this is what our job is to do to keep people safe. Modern Slavery Act, making sure that we're doing that. Conditions in our supply chain, what expectations we have from our suppliers from both a sustainability perspective, and then things like making sure we pay suppliers early. One of the things I made sure that we did do, particularly during the pandemic, but all the time, is that we're prompt payers of small businesses. So we behave in a particular way. So there's hard lines and then behaviors, and then there is the culture of what type of business are you going to support. So we have environmental, social and ethical policies that we set within the bank, the standards that we're prepared to lend by and support, and we balance those and make sure that we're doing what we think is the right thing, so that we have the right support for, you know, our customers, but within an ethical and social background. And you know, to give you an example, data is really an important thing, right? We have huge amounts of data on our customers, that we collect from, you know, being in their lives and seeing their payments and all the things that we do. We take our ethical responsibilities as important as our data protection responsibilities. So we don't use the data, you know, we don't sell the data on our customers, for example. We don't do any of that. We have a very clear ethical policy around our use of data for what we think is appropriate in terms of protecting our customers. We almost view that as in the same way as their money. Our job is to keep that safe for them as well. So it's hard driven through ethical, social and environmental standards in terms of how we lend, how we behave, and then there are cultural standards of how we expect our staff to treat people as well. And that's what we're constantly trying to make sure we do.
Alison, I suppose that there will be people who think of NatWest in comparison with other banks that you see on the high street, you know, your HSBCs or other. But actually, when you look at NatWest, it's really different. It's really a focused UK bank now. It looks really clearly like, probably more than, you might even make the case that more than any other business in the UK, it is itself a bet on the UK, right? How things go for you and for NatWest in the next decade will depend on how things go for the UK as a whole. And so I wondered whether, when you step back and you think about the prospects for the UK as an economy, what you think about its prospects in different parts of the country and for different people living in it, how you see it, what you think we should think are the upsides, the potential of the UK, but what, with a flinty view, are the real risks and causes of worry.
Yeah, I mean, we are a bellwether of the UK economy because we're, you know, on one side the third largest retail bank, but we're the #1 business bank. So we are inherently linked to the success of our customers. You know, that's the way I would always think about it. And also, I think the regional economies are very different. So, you know, we have regional boards around the country that tap into the local economies because they are very different and they have different dynamics happening. A few things I would say, you know, I think the UK, and you can see that through the pandemic, has an amazingly resilient business community, incredibly entrepreneurial. If you think about how business has survived, the economy has been put into a hard stop for effectively 6 months, and yet how I've seen entrepreneurs and small business owners cope and pivot their businesses and respond is really positive. And, you know, incredible resilience and incredible ambition. And this country still attracts a huge amount of inward investment in terms of, you know, fintechs and startups and entrepreneurialism, which, you know, SMEs are the lifeblood of the economy. You start a business, you create jobs, you grow, you contribute. So I think there's a huge amount to be optimistic about in terms of a nation of SMEs and, you know, real strengths in our economy through biotech, bioscience, you know, manufacturing, entrepreneurism, and the different sectors. So I think how we recover, I think there's real positivity. I think that the ability to export and import talent's a really important one, and we need to make sure we continue to be a place that is vital for skills coming in and being exported. I think that's a critical part of a thriving global economy. And we're still one of the global financial centres which you know, services the economy more broadly, and a big contributor to tax receipts, which drives that. So look, I think it's going to, you know, the global economy has been through a tough space. I think the UK has huge strengths. I think the retail on the consumer side, you know, people are saving a bit more, which is great for personal balance sheets. And so I think hopefully those good habits will continue, and we have to make sure we're creating a fair recovery and a fair transition. And I think as well, our position on ESG financing, green bonds, sustainability, renewable energy, all of those we're in a good position to do. So I think, of course there'll be challenges and tough times, but I'm positive about the recovery and the resilience that the UK economy and UK SME has shown during this period.
Alison, thank you. I wanted, if I could, just to bring in Andrew Cooper, Lord Cooper, just because I saw him here, and I got to know Andrew more than a decade ago, just on the eve of the financial crisis. And as I was listening to you, Alison, I was thinking to myself, there's an odd thing that's happening, which is a decade ago, we didn't want to hear anything from bankers, right? There was a kind of, there was a fury with bankers, and there was no role for them. Now, if you think about the drift of this conversation, we're saying to you, or at least I'm saying to you, what are you doing about female entrepreneurship? What's your policy for sustainability? How are you going to bring an ethical component to the way in which the market society works? And implicit in that is actually an expectation of social leadership from bankers. And Andrew, I didn't know whether or not in that, to be honest with you, whether I'm really out of touch. But for people who don't know, Andrew Cooper runs Populous, probably one of the best and most granular polling and opinion firms in the country. And Andrew, is there still a deep residual, either suspicion or resentment of the financial services industry, or are the expectations of banks and bankers changing, do you think?
I think both of those statements are probably true, James. Most people, it won't surprise, I think, people on this call, most consumers, their reflex reaction is to say that they don't trust big business, they trust small business, and that they don't trust banks. That's actually, it's a complicated question, because of course there's a sense in which of course they trust banks because banks look after their money for them. But there's a broader sense, which is certainly a residue of the financial crash, that big businesses and banks in particular, people tend to question their social values, their corporate values, the values of the kind of corporate entity rather than of the local experience of the bank. But what we have seen over the period is a significant shift in people's expectations of big businesses. So the sense that businesses in general and banks in particular should have a social purpose beyond just making money and doing what they do has grown significantly from being a minority view to being a majority view. Not everybody thinks that, and what people think that should mean in practice will vary, but now the expectations of what banks and other businesses do has changed hugely. COVID has been a big test of character in that sense. Businesses which assert that they have a social purpose, that they do their best to be kind of good community citizens, as it were. COVID has been a test of that for people, and I think coming out of COVID is also going to be a really big test for that, as the furlough scheme and other government support mechanisms come to an end. Clearly there's a big test for banks about how they respond to that challenge as a kind of test of the values that they say that they have.
And just out of interest, Andrew, because I know you do a lot of work in the financial world, in the business world, but actually you're best known for your work in politics. What do you make of the argument that says in some of these areas, not just the environment, particularly areas Alison mentioned, ESG, society and governance, that the case that businesses make that they're ahead of politics on issues of policy, that when it comes to, for example, even climate, the commitments that businesses are making are actually more ambitious than the commitments that governments are expecting?
I think that is definitely true. I think certainly the leaders in business and in finance in that field, the people who are kind of towards the front of the pack on that, are pushing ahead, I think, of where the politics is. Yes.
Well, Andrew, thank you. It's very nice to see you. Really good to hear from you. I'm gonna leave the last question, Alison, if I might, to my colleague Liz Mosley, who had actually was asked a much more interesting question. You won't have seen it in the chat, Alison, because I think the screen may be miles away from you. But Liz, why don't you put the point to Alison that you put in the chat?
Alison, it's been fascinating listening to you, but and we've, as you know, we've done a run of these. So there's yourself, you're the CEO of this enormous bank, and we had Sharon White at John Lewis and Michelle Mitchell, who runs Cancer Research UK. And I sit here and I listen to you talking about, financial and data risk, and how I try and set the agenda for sort of the sustainability of the people we're lending to, and how I worry about the call centres and just all of this stuff. And I'm thinking, how on earth do you cope? The accountability and the responsibility is so huge, and there's so much detail and granularity, and yet somehow you trust in the processes and the people around you. I just wonder, what do you worry about? There must be things that keep you awake at night, and how do you manage that anxiety? How do you sort of wear the cloak lightly so it doesn't just squish you to the ground?
Well, look, I think firstly, being asked to take on the role of CEO, it's, these jobs are enormous privilege. And, we touched a moment ago on the financial crash. I mean, I've seen when banks get it wrong, I can see the damage we do in people's lives, because we're so embedded in people's lives and providing capital to the economy. And so I think having a purpose-led strategy, which is what I've got, and knowing that we should be a force for good rather than bad is really important. So I think for me, recognizing the privileged position I sit in is really important. I think also, how do I keep calm running such a big organization? Well, most importantly, I have a great team, and it is a team sport. You don't always trust the processes. You make sure you go and check that they're working, recognizing that sometimes we'll make mistakes, and trying to control the things I can control, and then spending as much time as possible talking to customers and colleagues, so that we can react quickly and respond quickly, like we did during the pandemic, to make sure we do the right thing. And working really closely and being honest about what we're doing and what we'll get wrong and what we'll get right, and trying to make sure we're always doing the best job we possibly can, and listening to customers. So it's I control what I can control. I work with a good team of people, and I listen to my customers. That's what I can do to steer the ship. And I'm very lucky. I'm very privileged. I have a fantastic job, and I'm very privileged to do it, and I love my job. So that helps ease the days that you're lying awake at night wondering what you need to do. But that's how I do it.
Liz, thank you. And Alison, thank you very much. I control what I can control. When that Zen-like view of things abandons you because something really hits, do remember to call us, because we'd love to hear what that mood is like and those days are like as well. Alison, listen, I see that we're at the top of the hour. I just wanted to say thank you. It really is great when you get to hear these things. It's quite interesting, fun enough, as a journalist, sort of preparing for a conversation like this, because some of the things that make quote unquote news don't feel that interesting. I realized that we didn't talk about, does the government sell 5%? Does it not sell 5%? What's the overall profitability of banks, coming out of the pandemic? Some of these kind of core questions that I would normally ask. It's actually really interesting to hear about the judgments you make. And I should just say, personally, the thing that I'll probably take away from the conversation today is to hear your account of how you get an organization the scale and the size of NatWest to wrap its head around the climate emergency is most helpful, because that mix of three things, to say, look, we get our house in order, we commit to be net positive by 2025, means that the bank itself does what it says others should do. And then the split, I think, is really interesting, is let's deal with the problem cases, harmful, etc., and coal, but then let's also have an ambition that's positive, to cut the emissions of financing. That's such an enormous potential influence and impact. Actually, I think it's really helpful for us as a news organization in thinking about how do we measure what other organizations are doing. Do they meet those standards? And also, it's interesting for us to think about you. Do you bring that same lens to other areas of the bank's impact, whether it's on female entrepreneurship or social mobility or the geography of the UK? So thank you. It's been really interesting to listen to you. There's a question in the chat from Lorna that says, I wonder what the rest of your day looks like. I'd be really intrigued to know what the rest of your day looks like too, but we're going to leave you to it. So enjoy, and thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks very much. Really nice to chat to you. Thank you.
Thanks all. Have a very good day, everyone.